Oh, well, there's a lot to be learnt from the history that we have, or historicity is what we really have, isn't it? But if you, for instance, you look at an account of why the Spanish Armada was defeated by the English, and it wasn't because the guns of the English were in fact considerably better than the Spanish and could be loaded much faster. Well, in part, it was that the British ships were faster, so they didn't suffer the losses that they could have suffered. And of course, benefited much by not engaging with the enemy, by coming alongside and having their crews and military fight each other hand to hand. The traditional grape shot, I don't know how traditional it was at the time, but the grape shot sprinkling the deck of people was far more effective than the powerful guns. They were very difficult to aim, and it was said that one of the Spanish ships, for instance, suffered from 100 cannon balls actually hitting it, but didn't sink it. I mean, it just carried on. It's quite hard to sink a very solid wooden ship with what we would consider just throwing bits of metal at it. There were two things that seemed to have been significant. One, as recognised, the weather, the wind, and two, well, three things really. Two was that the commander was told by the King of Spain that he must stick to the plan, and the plan was to pick up soldiers from the French, or further up the coast anyway. Belgium, was it perhaps? And I believe they weren't actually assembled and ready there to be collected. And having got into the North Sea, effectively, it was very difficult to turn back and go against the west wind. It was, especially you then had to face the British. So he continued north. If he'd been free to exercise his own judgment, he might well have made a landing somewhere in northern England and simply established a Spanish base and so on. But he probably didn't feel free to do so, or inclined to do so, given he'd had a bit of a mauling from the British grape shot across the decks. So the bulk of his fleet was intact, and he judged that he could go around the north of Scotland, and provided he stayed well out in the Atlantic, he wouldn't end up on the Scottish or Irish rocks. But it seems that there wasn't the knowledge of the Gulf Stream's effect and the prevailing southwest flow, both airstreams and water off the coast of northern Scotland and Ireland. And whereas he thought he was well out to sea, he was much nearer the coast than he thought, and lost in total probably half of his ships in consequence. And interestingly, the crew that survived were very often employed by local farmers and married local girls, and that changed the genetic mix of the people in those regions. So really, although the British won, it wasn't because of the superior cannon, possibly in part the more nimble ships. And thinking they could sink the Spanish ships, were not anticipating drawing alongside, and they could avoid drawing alongside a Spanish galleon, simply because they were more nimble and more able to sail into the wind than the Spanish, than the enemy. But the significant gain was, of course, the concern of the King of Spain that his commander in the field, in this case the Navy, Prince of Medina, was it? I'm not sure. Whoever it was who was running the joint, stick to the plan. And the plan was greatly handicapped by having to rendezvous with other troops and then land at the Kent coast to try and proceed towards London, taking London. It was a plan for a quick control of the country. And of course the King of Spain had no intention of owning England. He simply wanted to make sure that the Protestants learnt their lesson and they got a Catholic monarch, like it or not, back on the throne. It was a war then with religious foundation, and I think you could say, looking at it, that God chose the outcome. Minimum cost to the English, massive prestige for the Queen of England, and for her navy. But to the original point that I was to make, which was that we can see in history how what we think is important isn't. It's not the decisive factor. And catastrophes like the Black Death, 1348, wiped out possibly a third of Europe's labour, actually seems to be background to the end of the Middle Ages. It's the key event that possibly, from an economist's point of view, one could argue, put power into the hands of the labour force because they were scarce. And so, for instance, if a bondman came to you as the employing lord, you ignored the fact that he wasn't a freeman, you just employed him. Whereas if he was a bondman, you'd send him back to his lord 50 years earlier. Well, it was great prestige for Elizabeth, of course. She was historically the greatest queen, greatest monarch, and female too. Presumably first queen. Yeah, I think so. And for the country's reputation, of course, as a Protestant leading powerful nation. And in a sense, I suspect, gave the background for the gradual build-up of the success of the British and formation later of an empire and so forth. That God was, in some sense, on their side. Yes, amazing. And needless to say, the Queen gave God the glory, and probably the country did too. But from a personal point of view, we can see how what looks like a crisis and a great difficult time can be to great good and blessing. Thank you, Dad.